A couple quick notes before we begin the show today. First, we have a ton of content, so I've actually split this episode into a double episode. In this part, we discuss the BC election and our quick takes on a number of small items of news around the federal government. In episode 34, we have a ton of stuff from the new Conservative dinner with Scott Gilmore that we went to last week, plus some thoughts on the Comey news out of the USA. Since this is all pretty timely, I wanted to get all of this out now before it's out of date. Speaking of which, in our discussion around the BC election in this episode, we mentioned a number of potential recounts coming up. Elections BC has today announced that it's approved recounts in Courtenay Comox, which is the riding that the NDP won by 9 votes, and Vancouver Falls Creek, which was won by the Liberals by 560 votes. Interestingly, the latter recount was approved not because of the NDP, but because of a request by the BC Citizens First Party candidate Philip James Ryan. There was a discrepancy of 4 votes between the ballot account and the tally sheet for Ryan, who got somewhere around 400 votes in total, so I guess that was enough to trigger a recount. It's all very strange, and I'm sure we'll get to it next week when there'll be lots more election stuff to talk about. And if you want to talk more with Scott and me about any of this, we'll both be at Vancouver Skeptics in the Pub on Tuesday at Jaegers. You can find details for that at vancouverskeptics.org. Now, let's get to the show. Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicos. This is episode 33, and we're recording this on May 12th, 2017. Politicos is a podcast that explores what's happening in British Columbia and across the country. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and leave a review on iTunes. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, where we're at PoliticosPod.
I'm Scott.
And I'm Ian. And it's never felt like more important to actually say what the date is, because everything seems very rapid and fluid. There was an election this week. We want to thank everyone who came out to our first live show / pub night party Tuesday night, who knew we could get dozen of people there. But it was still fun. It was a good crowd, and I really want to give a huge shout out to everyone who just spontaneously came by themselves, sort of not knowing anyone and just thinking it would be a fun night. And so that was pretty cool. So we'll definitely look forward to doing that again in the future, either when there's something else big happening or we just want to get drunk.
Yeah, I think that was successful, and we should definitely be looking into doing another one sometime soon.
Yeah, just maybe don't listen to the live shows we recorded that night, because I don't know if we were at top form. Maybe we were, but...
Well, I think as the night progressed, maybe the form decreased a bit.
Yeah, let's blame Eli, who bought our drinks for us, so... Let's jump into segment 1, 9 votes. So as I mentioned, this was the week of the BC election, which actually became much closer than everyone basically expected. It really was too close to call.
And as the title refers to, one riding actually came down to 9 votes. And that was what basically separated the prospect of a Liberal majority government and a Liberal minority government. So overall, the seat standings as of now, and we won't know the full ones until either somewhere around the 22nd to 24th of the month. But the current preliminary seat standings is 43 Liberal, 41 New Democrat, and 3 Green. And one of those New Democrat seats is Courtenay Comox, where there is a 9 votes difference between the NDP candidate and the Liberal candidate there.
There are a couple other seats that are really close as well when you have an election this tight. Coquitlam, Burke Mountain, Vancouver Falls Creek, and Richmond Queensborough were all very slight BC Liberal wins. And then there's Courtenay Comox, as you mentioned, and Maple Ridge Mission, which went narrowly to the BC NDP. So those 5 all have recounts scheduled for them. But a sort of even bigger wrench into this entire works is the fact there's 176,000 absentee ballots to be counted. For perspective, there were 1.8 million ballots cast in total, so about 10% of the election is still a big question mark, where the sort of difference is well under 176,000 votes, so we don't know who won yet.
No, we don't, and this is definitely going to be something that's going to be really interesting to follow, and I'm more than a little annoyed at Elections BC that they take 2 weeks to start the count on these ones, because, it's 2017. We're not sending the absentee ballots down to headquarters on the Barkerville stagecoach. Like, this is the sort of thing you should be able to get to the ridings for actual counting quicker.
Well, in that same vein, one of the funniest things that happened on election night is we didn't know the results of Oak Bay Gordon Head for hours after every other seat had basically finished counting, because apparently the phone line went down somewhere. And so we didn't know if Andrew Weaver was actually going to win his seat. So they projected 2 green wins without actually knowing if the leader would keep his seat. It was a fairly safe win for him, but it was still amusing just to sort of watch results come in and go, well, all the Greens except Andrew Weaver are winning tonight.
And just for context, this is literally a riding that is a 10-minute drive from the BC legislature. Like, they could have hailed an Uber and gotten the results in less time than it took to fix the phone lines.
Well, and we have cell phones, don't we? I don't know how they actually get these votes in, but it seems they still managed to get them in much faster than a UK election, though. So I was glad that we were able to sort of make a final statement about the election at 11 p.m., even though it still feels like it's hanging over us. But that's what keeps the show interesting for the foreseeable future. So there's sort of a few ways it could shake out. Right now we're sitting at this 43, 41, and 3. Kevin Milligan, a UBC Vancouver School of Economics researcher, sort of looked at past results and tried to figure out what's the likelihood, based on a simulation he ran, of it switching to a BC Liberal majority, going back down to a tie of 42, 42, and 3, or even the NDP picking up all the seats they needed and coming out ahead at 43 to 41. And disappointingly, I guess, for the New Democrats out there, there's still a 79% chance effectively that this result will hold, with a almost 10% chance that it will swing to the Liberals a bit more, and a almost 10% chance, I guess, that it will go to the NDP. So it's most likely that, I guess, we'll sort of stay at this range, because it might be that Comox flips, but one of those NDP recounts flips for them.
Yeah, although the analysis that Tim Milligan did showed that most likely it's just going to be no seats changed between now and the final which actually really says something, considering that there's literally 9 votes is all that's needed to change one of those ridings. But traditionally, based on past election results, the NDP has actually outperformed the Liberals when it comes to absentee ballots, and specifically in the Courtenay-Comox region too. And there's been a lot of speculation that because of the military base there, it's going to kind of swing things the other way, but and
the BC Liberal candidate, I guess, was a former commander at the base or something like that, so he might have connection. That might actually hurt him if he was a dick, but you know, the sort of internal machinations of how they might...
Yes, but at the same time, I'm not entirely convinced that that's likely to shift things too much. As far as I know, none of the units are in deployment right now, so you don't have just a huge whack of missing personnel. And it also wouldn't surprise me if military turnout is lower in provincial elections, just as get people from all over Canada, you know, a bunch of them are just going to be there for 2 years. They, you know, grow up in Quebec, get trained in Ontario, spend are in BC for a 2-year posting. Are you necessarily going to be that engaged in provincial politics to the point where you would go to the trouble of filling out an absentee ballot? And this would something I'd love to actually know the answer on what the turnout statistics are for military personnel at kind of the provincial and municipal level elections. But I'd be a little hesitant to kind of follow the nice, easy narrative that's been laid out where, you know, oh, it's a military base, a bunch of people aren't there from the military, they're all just going to vote for the center-right party. And, you know, having a big base down in Esquimalt didn't help the Liberals win in that region either.
Well, and even if this does swing to the Liberals, it's the most tenuous majority the Liberals could have. They still need to nominate a speaker from one of the parties. It's very unlikely the Greens are going to put up a speaker because they only have 3 MLAs and they actually want to try and have them all work as hard as Andrew Weaver has to get half the credit they probably think they deserve. The NDP probably also isn't going to be keen to put up a speaker when government is so close to reach. And the current speaker, Linda Reid, did, I believe, get re-elected, so there's a high chance she'll kind of just be this presumptive frontrunner that everyone will naturally support. So that means every vote, every MLA is going to have to be there if the government wants to get any legislation passed, especially their throne speech and budget, which are confidence votes. Well, and there's also the threat of by-elections or floor crossings or even just MLAs dying or retiring, which does actually happen on a predictable level. So the chance of the BC Liberals holding on to a 44 to 40 to 3 majority for 4 years are still pretty slim. So at some point, probably in the next less than 4 years, we will have an election again. But before we sort of go into the hypotheticals of where it goes from here, maybe we should just sort of reflect on the campaign. Like, no matter how we look at this, the Liberals lost a lot of seats, but they still managed to actually pick up a few in the interior. It was sort of interesting to watch the way the redistribution, almost the resorting of BC happened. The NDP picked up a bunch of seats in sort of lower mainland, while losing ground in the interior where they used to have a lot of strength with the sort of logging and mining communities.
Yeah, but you also have to look at where the campaigns actually campaigned, and John Horgan basically ignored the interior. His campaign definitely seemed to have that the province ends at hope mentality, where it was all about the lower mainland and the island. He basically didn't campaign up in the interior, up north at all, and there was a decision at NDP HQ to basically cede those territories to the Liberals in the hopes they could pick up seats in Metro Vancouver and later on in the campaign hold off the Green advance on the island. And I just don't really think that was a successful strategy. Yeah, they picked up some seats in the Lower Mainland, but it wasn't enough. They lost seats in the interior, and the Greens basically did as well as they were expected to do anyway, so they didn't really seem to have any effect on the island and spent the huge chunk of the last week's resources there.
Well, it's interesting to look at the Greens. I think they actually had quite a few second-place finishes. They had a very strong second place in New Westminster and Nelson, even in the interior. But those strong second places were kind of a distant second. Like, they beat the Liberals handily, but then they were nowhere near. I think it was ultimately the NDP in both of those ridings who were victorious. So the Greens almost peaked as much as they could without a significant swell of support to sort of push them over the top in like Victoria Beacon Hill and a few other ridings. They capped out at 3, and they could have picked up thousands more votes and not really gone any farther.
They definitely, picked up the easy ones, and if the NDP had, made some big tactical error rather than, arguably small ones they made near the end, you could have seen a groundswell of support for the Greens, or if, the Liberals, who are unlucky enough to live in Victoria Beacon Hill, wanted to really vote strategically and came out en masse to do so, they probably could have shifted things. But in terms of going further, I think they did have a viability question hanging over them, and put in a multi-member caucus in the legislature now has probably abated some of that, and we'll likely see a firmer base of support going forward in future elections, just because they now have effectively answered the yes, we can get people elected question.
Although that's also going to depend on what shakes out over the next legislature. If the Greens sell out their base, they could end up like the UK Liberal Democrats, and we can get to there in a minute. But I want to challenge the sort of almost failure of the BC NDP's campaign. I mean, we've seen really bad NDP campaigns in the last few years, Rachel Notley exception. But I think Horgan did spend a lot of time in the Lower Mainland, but it's almost clear, like, if he hadn't put as much emphasis as he did, he wouldn't have necessarily even got the seats he did, because there were a lot of really close races, and some that, like, just a little bit more, and he would have picked up even more. But also, like you say, sort of abandoned the north, abandoned big parts of the interior. But with the sort of challenge that Christy Clark had been emphasizing on jobs and resources and that sort of focus, it was almost inevitable maybe that they were going to lose those seats, and maybe the NDP even knew ahead of time that their strength in the interior was diminished. And so their path to a majority was suddenly very small, where it sort of ran through Metro Vancouver, through Vancouver Island, and picking up a couple seats along the coast, where maybe the peak they could have gone for is like 45, 46 seats.
Yeah, possibly, but at the same, like, these are areas that have not only just elected new Democrats at the provincial level, but have also done it federally. Like, there's in theory, ought to be a strong enough base of support that if one wanted to defend those ridings, they were defensible. And if anything, I think this kind of represents the shift that's happening within the NDP away from kind of its traditional labor roots that had a much more rural focus towards the kind of urban progressive core base of it. And the fact that they have abandoned a good chunk of the northern parts of the province and the interior, I think kind of speaks to that a bit.
Well, the conflict within the NDP that's been brought up so many times is that between labor and environment or whatever. And if you want to look at it so crassly, this time they basically chose urban environmentalists, and it proved more fruitful than trying to please everyone, potentially. Like, if they'd leaned in a little harder, they might have actually scooped up a bit more green support, which is kind of unfortunate for, the interior working class NDP supporters. But I think the platform the NDP ran on still had things there for them. They talked a lot about processing raw logs and bringing some of those jobs back and keeping mills open. Whether or not that was realistic is a different debate, but the sort of tokens were there to try to reach out to those communities. And
well, I think it also shows that just having a line in a platform isn't enough in a campaign. Is you actually need to put resources there and campaign in those areas if you want to have success there. And there's maybe they said the right things, but didn't put any money or resources into a get out the vote effort, and lost because of that. Like, it's even if their supporters were there, without the campaign infrastructure and all the resources that needs to be marshaled to run an effective modern campaign, you're playing with one hand tied behind your back in that case.
All right, well, let's pivot from the NDP campaign. I sort of mentioned how the Liberals lost a lot of ground, and that sort of felt inevitable based on the pile-ons of negative press and fundraising scandals and all of these other challenges Christy Clark came in with. She also had the strength of being known as this strong campaigner and sort of showed that in not being utterly destroyed. But I still find it hard to play it as a win when you go from a majority government to not.
Yeah, this definitely was not a win for Clark in anything but the exceeded expectations game. There was definitely an air that this was a change election, that Clark was unpopular, it was her time to go. The fact that she did manage to pull out a plurality of the popular vote, however slim that was, I think goes to show that the Liberals ran a fairly strong campaign when they had a lot of barriers to overcome. And but the only thing they went into the campaign ahead on was having a better war chest, being able to outspend the other parties. But other than that, they were unpopular. Everybody knew of all the scandals that had accumulated. There just wasn't really a huge amount going for them. They didn't offer any big vision of where the province should be going. And yet, through all of that, they were able to maintain that slim victory in the popular vote, a slim victory in the number of seats. So it's definitely a loss compared to where they started out, but in terms of where everybody expected them to be, I think it kind of have to call this a success with a giant asterisk beside it.
Yeah, the Liberals definitely blew a lot of credibility in the Lower Mainland with their lack of action or sort of very late action on the housing crisis, almost no action on transit, and then the things they did pitch didn't really feel like solutions, but potentially like the grants to new homeowners, almost like fuel to the fire, pitched as a solution. And so I think people sort of saw through that, and even Clark's own ministers, I think, in the Lower Mainland had a lot of difficulty pitching that to voters, and that's why we saw ministers of the government lose their seats, people who should be pretty safe. Meanwhile, she was able to sort of hammer on the jobs to sort of win over the interior where jobs are a bigger concern.
Yeah, I forget whose line this was, but someone basically said the Liberal platform is fine if you like the status quo and everybody else will dislike it. And I think that was more or less true, is people who kind of thought the province was going in the right direction, even if they didn't like Christy Clark, those were the people who came out and actually voted Liberal, and everybody else who had at least one complaint about, or at least one big complaint about transit, housing, all of that, were the ones who opposed it. So, like, if you had a good last 10 years, you were probably not really wanted to roll the dice on a new government. And that was basically how they, I think, eke this out, is that there were enough winners in the last decade's growing economy to be able to play to that jobs message. And, we're going to keep house prices high and not do anything to kind of disturb the market too much, that they were able to eke out a narrow win, but they were just kind of running on empty with respect to everybody else. And I think also having a solid and experienced campaign staff definitely helped. The I Am Linda thing did kind of take over more coverage than it needed to, but outside of that hiccup, they ran a very smooth message-oriented campaign where, like you said, it was just jobs. That was all they were talking about. And, they stayed on message. They hammered the message home again and again. And, it sunk in with enough voters to really make a difference.
Well, and the Greens managed to keep on their message throughout the whole thing. They were the sort of not either the devils so there was a try us because you don't like those other two. And I think because of how small the Greens were, and because he was sort of coming from one seat and not a huge swell of support, it didn't get the same attacks on him. So Christy Clark could go after the NDP for their record in tax and spend. But when you look at the Green platform, it was a higher taxes and higher spending kind of platform. But there wasn't a lot of attack on that, other than when Christy Clark sort of wanted to attack both of them. And also the Greens and Liberals weren't really competing anywhere against each other, so Christy Clark is kind of happy to let the Greens eat into some NDP support, even if it might steal some Liberal votes in some areas where she wasn't going to win anyway. So it was a pretty, I don't want to say easy campaign. They definitely worked their ass off and did a professional job, even when there were little hiccups and embarrassments from candidates who didn't live in ridings or who made a fool of themselves with a speech, they're still able to sort of move on from that and go like, oh, laugh it off. We're the small party. Don't worry about that. We're still learning.
Yeah, I think some people did probably cut them a little more slack on that sort of thing where, it's just hard for a party with one seat and 5 paid staff members or something like that to, do a thorough job vetting 84 candidates. There were a couple of ridings they didn't run people in just because they couldn't get the candidates nominated quickly enough. And so with that kind of lack of resources they went into it with, they did a fairly good job of managing the problems. And, there were some issues. They picked a couple of not great candidates who had some rather embarrassing stuff they'd said before that came up again. Although, to be fair to them, the NDP, who do have a full professional staff, managed to nominate somebody who had an active defamation court case going against him, where the verdict was rendered during the campaign, and that was just a colossal screw-up nominating him. That's the sort of basic vetting that anybody with, a proper full-on party apparatus just shouldn't have done. But the Green Party was kind of able to overcome those sorts of things and return to message fairly quickly. And I think there was a little more willingness on the part of the general electorate to kind of overlook those little slip-ups, because there's that recognition they're kind of a small party that's really trying to grow hard, and there's going to be some of those growing pains.
Yeah, and I was very skeptical that they would be able to get their vote out. And I think what happened in the end is they were actually really effective at getting their vote out in 3 ridings. And then the other ones, it was that sort of didn't quite meet expectations. I mean, Jonina Campbell in New West did great for being in the Metro Vancouver area, but she wasn't challenging that seat, or wasn't realistically going to win that seat. And so in other ridings, they didn't really materialize. So it's almost that 17% they hit on election night.
And I think part of that is just where the campaign decided to put its resources, and being such a resource-limited campaign, hitting the 3 most likely seats to win is probably the smart strategic move. And we might have some volunteers who can, in the metro area, who can all kind of come out to New West because that's the most likely seat to win. Like, there probably wasn't a huge amount of actual party level resources put into that, and they were all focused in those 3 ridings on the South Island where it turned out to really make a difference, and those were kind of the obvious ones to do. Adam Olsen only lost his bid for election in 2013 by 300 some odd votes, so that was one of the ones you'd want to really push hard on, and they did well by putting their resources in there. And running against the same 2 opponents, he came out significantly further ahead with a much wider margin. I think that kind of shows where the Greens were smart in putting all their emphasis on picking the right seats and focusing on that. Though during the last little bit of the campaign, the NDP came after them pretty hard. The official campaign definitely were going after them on the South Island, and the kind of unofficial, just social media mob of NDP supporters were really going after the Greens hard.
Well, and even people I saw who aren't like full partisans, but just sort of in the, let's get Christy Clark out going, this is probably not the election to vote Green. I saw that a lot too. So I think that message did permeate out. It obviously didn't reach everyone, or enough people didn't care. But yeah, it's hard to say how big of an effect that really did have in terms of sort of suppressing some of the Green vote. Or if people just got to the ballot box and said, fuck it.
At least with me, it had gotten to the point where it was the not so rational part of my brain was like, fuck these guys, I really don't want to be supporting the NDP after what I've seen on this. And, that's not the most rational response, but I'm sure a lot of people were feeling that way regardless. And kind of it had passed the, we're going to try and convince you into the, we're now sworn blood enemies sort of thing. And I think that might have gone far enough over the line. It put a lot of those kind of soft Green supporters' backs up, and maybe made the whole reach out and convince them to vote strategically campaign less effective overall.
Well, we're on this sort of angle and this animosity. The sort of only path for Horgan to become premier right now is with a lot of help from Dr. Andrew Weaver and his 2 friends. Do you think they'll actually be able to get along? A lot of the sort of progressive campaigners are highlighting the fact that platforms overlap a lot. Horgan, in his sort of victory speech, whatever it was at 11 o'clock or midnight on election night, emphasized, we want to bring in proportional representation. We want to ban big money in politics, and we want to turn the page and push forward an environmental agenda, making clear and obvious sort of reaching gestures towards the Green Party and messages he sort of kept on for the last couple of days. But do you think there's room for that to work out?
A lot of the vitriol did kind of evaporate right around 10:30 on election night. So there does seem to be a bit of an effort to bury the hatchet, and there was some mention during the campaign that Weaver doesn't find Horgan the easiest person to work with, and it's a little hard to tell how much of that was just campaigning and how much of that is the actual state of their relationship. But I can't really see the Greens wanting to go any other way. You don't want to come out and say the NDP are the people you want to work with the most, and Weaver's done a good job of kind of maintaining enough ambiguity in where he wants to go that kind of everybody's rushing around trying to suss out where he wants to go, and there's probably a lot of backroom chatter as a result, and that's a smart move on his part. But ultimately, I can't see the Greens really backing anyone else but the NDP. There's actually just a poll I saw today that said that 3/4 of Green supporters don't want the Green Party to be working with the Liberals, and I believe it was 93% considered Christy Clark untrustworthy. And those are the sorts of numbers that from your base that you really got to pay attention to. It can really come back and bite you. And with the similarities in the platform, the dislike of the Liberals by the Green base, I just can't see any viable path forward that is in the long-term interest of the Green Party other than working with the NDP.
Well, the first two challenges are that Christy Clark gets the first shot because she was the premier before the election. The lieutenant governor has already spoken with Christy Clark and, in Christy Clark's words, asked her to stay on as premier. So Christy Clark gets the first chance to test the confidence of the legislature when they come back, which brings me to the sort of second impediment to the Greens actually working with the NDP is that they don't actually have to call back the legislature until October. They could call it back sooner, and one would sort of hope they do since the budget didn't pass, so our province is kind of just spending with no plan, technically. But there's no parliamentary requirement that we have a sitting until October. So Christy Clark could just sort of stay on as premier, almost running the government by fiat until October, at which point she can test the House, potentially in that time putting out the test to the Greens to see what things they would need to pass a throne speech, or at least abstain, because if she gets enough for the opposition members to abstain, she can still win. She doesn't need a majority of the votes. She just needs the most votes. And if she can pass the throne speech in October and a budget shortly after, she can hold on for a bit longer. And even if she goes down in October, it might be long enough away that it goes right back to an election rather than giving the other two a chance. It's tough to say at that point.
And that is also a really bad look on a premier to not call back the legislature, keep it vacant, and just kind of try and hold on to power as long as they can. And yeah, technically she doesn't have to call it back, but if we're now into, say, August, nothing's happened. The two opposition party leaders are, furious at the Liberals for not calling back the legislature and actually testing the confidence of the House. I could easily see them working out, if not a formal coalition, a supply and confidence agreement where they then go to the lieutenant governor and say, hey, we have the numbers to hold the confidence of the House. Make one of us premier, and most likely Horgan, and go forward from there.
And that's where it gets complicated, is which of these scenarios play out. I know the other thing that sort of throws a wrench into the works is there's potentially also going to start to be the knives coming out in the Liberal Party itself. There's one article that Kevin Falcon, former BC Liberal minister, has sort of written somewhat critical of the Clark campaign, saying they maybe made some mistakes turning its back on Metro Vancouver. And that's a very sort of softball criticism relative to what's probably happening in the back rooms, where people are going, is it time for someone else to take the ship? Because there's a strong argument within the BC Liberals that it's not their policies that were unpopular, but their leader. And if they could put a new face on it and cut some of the sort of scandals and bring in some minimal amount of campaign finance reform, maybe they don't have to go all the way, but, make the basic steps, then they could push another election. and do a lot better.
Yeah, I could definitely see where the gears are turning in some party members' minds on that. And if you look at just how BC has traditionally voted, the kind of not NDP coalition, whichever banner they're running on at the moment, tends to do pretty well unless there's a split amongst them. And, that's basically been the only time the NDP have actually been able to win is when there's some split, like in the 90s. So I could definitely see them going, hey, we have kind of the natural ruling party of BC here, but our own screw-ups have made us kind of unelectable. Let's kind of do a little house clearing. And even before the election, kind of the background chatter was that this was going to be Christy Clark's last election, regardless of how it went. So I can kind of see that getting to be a little more of a question that's brought to the forefront in the coming weeks.
I'm sure we would have heard none of that chatter if she had a very strong, sizable majority, but since that's not the case at all, the knives are going to be sort of being sharpened. But I think because we're in this sort of big question mark phase, everyone's going to keep them close to their chest and just wait for the opportunity. And I don't know if there is a sort of successor in the wings in the BC Liberals yet.
And I don't think we'll hear anything until after the 24th of May when the final count is released. And we actually know how those roughly 10% of absentee ballots have gone and, what the actual seat count is. Because right now, this is all incredibly theoretical and predicated on the fact that there isn't a huge change in the balance of power or the seat counts. And remember, the Liberals managed just to pick up one more seat on net with the absentee ballots coming in. This completely changes the whole question. Christy Clark now has a majority, albeit a slim one, and all these who's Weaver going to back questions. Do they recall the legislature questions? They just become moot at that point. So at the start of this election and kind of right before we started to watch the results come in, both of us had made some predictions on it. Early on, I was kind of counting on a bit of a green surge, and they were going to get 5+ seats. And you were kind of thinking the Greens were going to utterly collapse, and it was going to be, the grand orange wave sweeping over the province.
Well, I never said grand orange wave. I said they could squeak through a majority.
I may be editorializing a bit.
Even on election night, I was sort of going through the list and figuring if the NDP did really well, I was thinking they could get into the 46, 47 kind of majority. They didn't. And the Greens did a little better than I expected, and they managed to pick those 2 ridings up handily. But beyond that, I don't think the Greens met your expectation. They sort of exceeded mine, so they averaged that. On election night, you did sort of hope it would be a tie, but I think that was more joking than...
Yeah, I honestly wasn't super sure how it was going to shake out, and I kind of threw out what was a plausible and most interesting scenario of 42-42-3. And there was a long time during that night where that was the number up on the screen, and I was pretty hopeful I actually called it right.
Until Sam Sullivan managed to squeak back into False Creek over Morgaine.
Yeah, so there is a little bit of me that's kind of just hoping when the final count comes in, it flips that way, just so I can claim credit for predicting it. And plus, it's just going to make all of these questions even more interesting going forward.
Well, and for the pollsters, it was a much closer election than the previous one. Most of them actually were within margins of error. And I think we'll hopefully be getting deeper into the polls next week, so I don't want to get into that too much because we're hoping to get a guest that would be perfect for this. But listen next week because we'll have a lot more to talk about in the election.
Okay, well, moving on to some of our quick takes. The Senate has put out a big report on kind of the state of the military and its funding with a whole bunch of recommendations, and this precedes the defense review that was supposed to be coming out soon and being delayed a bit, but we'll definitely be covering it in a lot more detail when it does. But this report from the Senate Defense Committee highlights some major deficiencies and makes a bunch of recommendations when it comes to the Canadian military. among them, they strongly suggest that the F-35 should be the fighter that Canada purchases, and that the procurement should be doubled in size from the original plan up and increased to 120 fighter aircraft, which actually seems pretty reasonable. 65 was always way too low to maintain any sort of operational tempo where you can have forces overseas, patrolling the north, doing workup training and reconstitution after deployment. Just 65 fighters just isn't a huge amount, so it makes a bunch of sense that they're calling for more fighter aircraft to be purchased.
And this is the sort of biggest headline of the report, because the Liberals ran on not getting the F-35s, but having an open competition for any other fighter, because their criticism was the Harper government sort of cut the corners and made a bad deal on the F-35, so Trudeau really doesn't like that. I always thought the NDP had a better line on this, which was, if it's such a bad deal, let's scrap that deal, but open it up. And if the F-35 comes out of an open process, then we'll go with it. And that just seemed more logical, at least. It was more consistent than just obsessively going, no F-35s. And now we're into this situation where everyone else is going, actually, F-35s weren't the worst idea ever. Maybe it wasn't a good deal we were getting, and it was done in terrible secrecy, but there's not that many other great designs out there.
Yeah, the problem with the F-35 was it kind of always the procedural aspect of how we got to the contract more than the actual planes we were getting. And it's a fighter aircraft that's been over budget and has had technical problems, but basically so's every other fighter project since the Second World War. So it's of course good to be kind of skeptical and look at that sort of contract and procurement critically, but some of the criticisms of the F-35 I think were kind of oversold a bit. But in addition to that, they've also suggested that the government does not proceed with the interim purchase of more CF-18s, in this case the Super Hornets, and once again, actually that seems like a pretty solid recommendation. We discussed the reasons why back when the initial announcement was made, but it's basically a lot of money to maintain a second fleet, costs a bunch of money. It's almost certainly going to soften the political pressure to actually purchase the fighters we do need, and it's just pushing the problem down the road at the cost of a bunch of money.
And I don't remember what episode that was, so you better just go back and listen to the entire back catalog of the show.
But in addition to that, let's kind of focus on some of the other areas they're looking at, such as a recommendation to buy 12 diesel-electric submarines to replace the 4 that are already in the Navy's inventory.
Well, as far as I remember, the 4 we have are kind of junk, aren't they?
I think that's putting it mildly. Junk would be an improvement over some of them. Yeah, they were in bad shape when we bought them a decade and a half ago from the Brits secondhand, and billions of dollars and years in dry dock haven't gotten them to be a huge amount better. And, they're sort of quasi-operational, but I don't think anyone seriously looks at them and say, that's a well-working subfleet right there. On the other hand, 12 subs cost a lot of money, and I can't even see the most gung-ho conservative government shelling out that kind of money to expand the submarine fleet by 3 times. Interestingly, although they were pretty pro expanding the Navy and arguing for a lot more shipbuilding, they were pretty critical of the Arctic Offshore Patrol Ship. Senator Kenney calling it a dog. Interesting term, but since we bought the plans from the Norwegians and kind of tried to Canadianize them in a process that has ended up costing us more money than the Norwegians spent on their entire program from concept to ships in the water, we've kind of scaled back their capabilities. They can only go through 1-year ice, and the armament's being downgraded to a Bushmaster, which, for the people who aren't familiar with, that's the 25mm gun you see on the light armored vehicles in the Army. This is a pea shooter as far as the Navy's concerned, and was a nice idea in concept to put these Arctic Offshore Patrol vessels in, but the execution has been bungled from the start, and I'm not sure what we'll begin at the end of this is actually worth all that much. So that was kind of the big procurement aspects they were focusing on. Some of the other recommendations were to actually shift procurement from Public Services and Procurement Canada and move it entirely within D&D. And they talked a lot about the Australian model and how that's worked fairly well for the Australians. And similar country, similar kind of low density, smallish population, big area to defend. And, they don't have a lot of the same problems that we do in terms of just funding and running a military effectively. Other interesting suggestions they had were becoming a partner in the U.S. ballistic missile defense and creating a joint cyber defense system with the U.S., which, with today's news of the cyber attacks against the British health system and a whole bunch of other places, actually seems like a pretty solid idea. Yeah, overall, they're calling for a lot more resources to be put in the military, bring it up to the 2% of GDP spending, and they highlight that under the current funding right now, we're underspending by $2 billion on just what's needed to maintain the military. So, that's basically, the military's running a deficit right now, and it's eventually going to come back and bite us.
I think this report sort of reflects what we would need to do to keep the rhetoric of the sort of liberals and conservatives of, if we care about the military and the way they talk about it, this is what you want to do. If we want to have a radically different version of our role in the world, then this could be seen as a ridiculously militaristic one. And why do we need 21? Like, they literally say, let's buy a whole bunch more helicopters. Let's buy more submarines. Let's buy more frigates. Let's go beyond what the conservatives said. So none of this is going to happen. The liberals aren't that gung-ho.
In fact, they're so un-gung-ho, they've put off $8.5 billion of much-needed capital investment in the military.
So this is great fodder for the Conservative Party to go after the liberals. The NDP is going to think this is ridiculous.
Well, I think the NDP would think it was ridiculous if we're spending $1 billion on the military. Let alone
money should go to the troops, Scott. That money should go to the veterans and supporting them. But it's an interesting report. This is definitely up your alley, and
I think we'll have to wait for the big defense review to come out soon, and we'll be definitely dedicating a full segment at least to that.
Yeah. Well, and I just wanted to also add on, while we're sort of talking about the Senate, just a sort of super quick follow-up to last week, that Senator Don Meredith did resign without saying, I resign, this last week. So he's gone. And that's good, because I think, as we talked about, he's embroiled in all kinds of scandals, and it was actually a shock he stuck around this long.
Yeah, kind of the consensus here was that there just wasn't that much worth fighting for to be a senator, especially one taking that much heat.
And I did confirm in the reporting on his leaving that he is going to collect his pension, so he'll be just fine. But next up, there were a lot of different little stories about Justin Trudeau this past week, and I think it's easiest to just sort of bundle them all together as almost a sort of weird but bad news week for Justin Trudeau. The sort of biggest one I think that caught both of our eyes was that in the first 18 months of the Trudeau Liberal government, they've actually only passed 17 government bills. They have a few more in the works, but there's a lot of suspicion that they're going to prorogue Parliament for the summer, in which case they'd be resetting their legislative agenda and then starting all over again. And it raises the question of whether that sort of independent Senate is actually a bigger liability for Trudeau than it was sort of an advantage at first. Then there were two quick stories that everyone's made fun of already. The $1,900 that went to 14 cardboard cutouts, which is ridiculous, but it's actually probably a pretty good deal. But also, who needs Justin Trudeau cutouts?
That's assuming there's any dollar value that's a cardboard cutout of Justin Trudeau is worth, and that's something I'm not entirely, or that's something I'm a little skeptical of.
I think they need to print them off officially, have them sign it, and then just eBay them, and that could be a new revenue source.
Interestingly, when they announced they were no longer going to be doing this and getting rid of their cardboard cutouts, I checked the government's surplus auction site, and sadly they were not available for resale.
Not yet. A less good value for money, though, was the story about the government spending $16,000 for Snapchat filters. And I know the Liberals like to appeal to, I guess, teenagers and the youth, as it were. We're both millennials, but I don't think either of us have ever touched Snapchat because we're just...
Used it very occasionally, but
okay.
I can't think I've ever used a filter on it. So you can kind of pinpoint my level of engagement
You're
with Snapchat.
that much younger than me that you have touched Snapchat. And finally, but potentially more substantively, the government has scheduled a committee hearing for its big bill that's going to establish an infrastructure bank.
Actually, I wouldn't even say that's accurate. It's as part of the omnibus budget legislation. So this isn't even a dedicated bill for the infrastructure bank, but kind of just tucked in all the other budget legislation is enabling legislation for the infrastructure bank, and parliamentary committee that's going to be looking at it, the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, basically has only gotten a day and a couple hours of time to look at the infrastructure bank. And this is something the government's going to be putting $35 billion in, and is going to be responsible for over $400 billion of total funding between the government and private sector and pension funds and kind of investor funds. And overall, that's a lot of money that's going to be managed and run through this. They're spending less time on this than I do researching what car I want to buy. It seems an absurdly little amount.
And if they're only spending that much time on this big plan, how is it that they've only gotten 17 bills through? I think putting all these four stories together kind of is a way of refocusing the lens of the sunny ways. And it goes, this Liberal government promised to be different and do things differently. And instead it seems a lot about image and not really getting anything accomplished, or where they do, they sort of just rhyme it through.
Yeah, it's kind of the Harper method of government, but with a better PR team.
Harper plus cardboard cutouts and Snapchats.
Yeah, which coincidentally is basically what Andrew Scheer's platform's been. Well, not the cardboard cutouts, but the Harper with better PR. But yeah, it does raise the big question of kind of, if they're spending so little parliamentary time on this stuff, how are they not getting more accomplished? One other bit of press Justin Trudeau got this week was his response to the flooding that's happening in eastern Canada. So yeah, not only is part of the interior BC flooding, but so is the area around Quebec and Gatineau and Ottawa, and causes a huge amount of problems. The military is being deployed, but the piece I want to focus on is his response to the kind of rebuilding aspect of it, and specifically where he says that, we're going to have to understand that bracing for 100-year storms is maybe going to happen every 10 years now or every few years. And that means as we look to rebuild our communities, our homes and infrastructure, we're going to have to think about what we can do to rebuild better. So kind of maybe we're going to be changing the government's emphasis on this sort of thing. And this kind of also is right after Scott Gilmore, the Maclean's columnist, for speaking about in our second segment, put a big column in Maclean's suggesting that it's time we stop paying for people's riverfront views.
So this is Gilmore trying to maybe boost his fiscal conservative credentials. I can't tell if it's that or him just trying to fill column space, which is another thing he also suggested was a reason he wrote the New Conservative column, was just, let's pitch an idea and see what happens.
It's probably a bit of both, because this, on the kind of wonkier fiscal conservative side, this is the sort of thing that's been talked about quite a bit.
But I think part of it suffers from the idea that people actively chose to live in a precarious situation. The stability of and relative safety from flooding of the houses right on Montreal riverbanks is pretty long term. He gives a metaphor in his column of living under this dangling rock, and then we shouldn't really feel pity for those people. But this is more you live next to a cliff face, but 20 years later, 30 years later, there's a rock that's slowly coming over the edge. And for that person, I feel a bit more pity, because it's not like they knew that this would be happening or that it would be happening regularly. Now, that's not to say when we rebuild, we can't rebuild smarter, and that's something that happens after sort of every natural disaster, and we need to find ways to mitigate against future flooding because it's inevitable, and is there a way to sort of compensate? And it might be the case after some disasters that there are areas that are no longer habitable. I mean, this happens in New Orleans after Katrina. The risk, though, is making sure that you don't just sort of use this as a way to push through almost disaster capitalism a la Naomi Klein, where you go, oh, all the poor people are out of the way now, so we can gentrify the fuck out of it. And so I have problems with that, too. But
yeah,
there's all kinds of things to unpack there, I'm sure.
Yeah, so the general gist of Scott's article is that the tendency for federal and provincial governments to step in and kind of throw all this, disaster relief money and kind of basically act as homeowners' flood insurance that they pay no premiums for beyond just their general taxes leads to people underappreciating the risk and therefore acquiring basically high-risk property without actually kind of paying for the actual costs themselves of said high-risk property. And that this leads to a whole bunch of wasted money as we continually bail people out of these situations, both literally and figuratively. And that, if there was kind of a much firmer line in the sand of if you want to live here, fine, but you're assuming the risk, you'd have fewer people subject to these sorts of disasters because some people would opt to live in, safer areas or places where they, could actually get flood insurance at a reasonable rate. And it would also save kind of the country as a whole money, as we're not constantly wasting resources rebuilding these communities when they do get flooded.
Yeah, I think my biggest issue is just the realistic effect of that policy essentially pricing people out of the homes that they may have lived in for a long time or, had. And then you're basically changing overnight the price of their homes. I mean, the big criticism of empty house tax or even the way the foreign buyers tax was brought in BC was it's just this sort of snap decision to change the pricing. And even if you sort of gradually increase it, you could still push people out.
Yeah.
And so maybe the way is to sort of affect it on new home prices or some way there so that if they're flipping the homes and the new people in sort of assume the risk, but people aren't penalized just because they grew up in that house.
Yeah, but at the same time, I'm not sure because people have priced in this bad policy, we should continue with it. It's a great way to run government. And you just end up paying more in the long run because not wanting to change things means you just constantly have these costs recurring again and again when these floods happen or other disasters. And yeah, this probably isn't the sort of thing you just want to bring in overnight. And politically, it's a terrible thing to do right immediately after this sort of thing happens. But, like you suggest, maybe no new construction gets covered by this policy and 10-year phase out of it afterwards or something else. But it has to be upon local governments to kind of address some of their development policies that make it harder to kind of just shift the sort of infrastructure and kind of where people are living quite as quickly. And I'm not super in touch with kind of the Ottawa urban or Gatineau urban development situation, but if it's anything like Vancouver, that could be a 20-year hard-fought battle to change a few buildings at a time. And, it might not be the sort of thing that's easily done. You need to do reforms at multiple levels on this one, I think, to really bring it in. But ultimately, it's probably the best place to be going to.
Well, sticking at the sort of federal news level, which is where all our quick takes came this week for some reason, the federal court has struck down some of the provisions of the Citizenship Act that were brought in under the Harper government. Specifically, some of the changes brought in, which the Liberals, I believe, campaigned to repeal, but haven't gotten around to yet.
Maybe if they, passed more than 17 bills in 18 months, they would have.
Basically, the court struck down the ability of the citizenship minister to strip people's citizenship without hearings. So the idea under the Harper government was that, well, there might be people who lied or misrepresented themselves when they got their citizenship, and we shouldn't have to keep these fake citizens in the country. But the problem is the way they brought it in suggested they didn't necessarily have a right to a hearing, in which case they could defend themselves and say, actually, I didn't lie, I just didn't understand the form, or make some kind of case, sort of a due process argument. I'll give full disclosure, I was just elected to the BC Civil Liberties Association Board of Directors last night, so this is something
Congrats, by the way.
I'm very passionate about, or they're very passionate about, and very good at arguing about. And this is that sort of second-class citizenship stuff people were talking about. It'll be interesting to see where the Liberal government goes forward with this. Hopefully they'll roll back these changes and start to ensure that, like Trudeau said, a citizen is a citizen is a citizen. And whether you got that honestly or falsely, you deserve the same right to a fair and judicious hearing.
Yeah, this seems to be a pretty common sense decision. There was definitely a lack of due process that needed to be corrected, and yeah, this seems to be a pretty obvious and simple ruling to kind of correct that, but it's too bad it had to end up going through the courts rather than the obvious political fits that the new government had promised. And finally tonight, the federal Liberal government has introduced legislation to ban tankers from BC's North Coast. So under this legislation, vessels carrying more than 12,500 metric tons of crude or persistent oil will not be permitted to operate in the region from the northern tip of Vancouver Island up to the Alaska border. And only vessels delivering quantities beneath that to communities in that region will be allowed to transport crude or persistent oils.
This is great news for the environmentalists in BC. I think it's, in general, good news. My one worry as I think about this is those tankers are still going somewhere, and this is probably going to drive all of that traffic into Vancouver Harbour, and especially as we decide whether or not, I guess it depends on who becomes the next premier, whether or not Kinder Morgan gets doubled and all of that tanker traffic comes here. Hopefully it's sort of a part of a phase off of fossil fuels, but this is definitely going to piss off Alberta because they want their oil sent everywhere.
Yeah, I think it's just, yet another nail in the coffin of the Northern Gateway project. But yeah, I do think you're right that it will kind of divert any tanker traffic that does exist in BC, down to the southern coast, although this is merely formalizing an already kind of informal ban that was in effect. And at the same time, I can kind of see if you are going to be needing to move some quantity of oil through British Columbia, it kind of makes the most sense to do it in the South Coast where you have all of the response resources, all, the government agencies and offices are located. It just makes sense to kind of do it in the very well monitored and well resourced part of the province.
Well, and very well mapped. A lot of the northern BC coastline is very rugged, very rocky. It's not smooth all around here, but at least we have a good sense of where all the hazards are.
It's actually shocking kind of how coarse some of the mapping data in parts of the Canadian waters are. So
the only thing to keep an eye on here is how quickly this moves through, because this is just an act introduced at the House of Commons in first reading. Like we've said, 17 bills, and how long will it take this one to go through, or if it ever will?
Now, if the way things are going, this might end up being an election issue because it'll be pending legislation in 2019. And that has been Politicos. Find links to the stories we mentioned in the show notes at politicos.ca. Make sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at PoliticosPod. Leave us a review and let us know what you think. And if you have any ideas for the show, feel free to send them to us. Thanks for listening.